I want to invite you this morning to open with me to Matthew chapter 16, if you would. Matthew chapter 16, and we're actually going to look at the next couple chapters together. But I want us to begin with a verse that's found in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 24. This statement of Jesus is positioned right after Peter makes his confession that he believes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And in making that confession, he apparently speaks for all the disciples who have the same conclusion about Jesus, that He is God's Son. And so look at what Jesus says in verse 24 in response to the disciples and their confession. He says, "If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake shall find it." The surprise about Jesus being the Christ and being the Messiah is that He was a Christ, that He was a Messiah who came to suffer. He didn't come to reign. He didn't come to rule, although ultimately He would do those things. He came to suffer. He came to win victory and to win reign by redeeming us from sin, so that He could exercise His sovereignty over all those things that captivate us. Sin and death and pain and suffering. All the things that are the consequences of sin in the world. And by winning sovereignty, by winning control, by winning victory over all of those things, by defeating death and by defeating sin, He would win our allegiance to Him. Because we would see the price that He would pay in order that He might rescue us from all the things that we invited into our life because of our rebellion against God. David has so articulately talked about those things as he's spoken about the blessings that we find in the cross. And one of the blessings that we find in the cross, and that Jesus announces to us here in Matthew 16 and verse 24, is that there is a cross for us. There is a cross for us. We get to follow Him in this path. We get to travel the way that He trod. We get to bear our cross and follow after Him. And it might not look like, as John so well said in the song that we looked at, that there's two pictures. There's what we see when we see the pain and we see the agony and all that's a part of the cross. But then we also see the purpose that's a part of the cross and what was accomplished there. And when we think about bearing our cross, it's not something that just stirs us in our own human and fleshly nature to want to run after Him in this. But it is the path that's best for us, and it is the path that exalts God, and it is the path that ultimately serves the purpose that is both good for us, that is good for the world, and that is the greatest worship that we give God. One of the ways that the cross blesses you and me today is that it becomes the pattern for how we live. It becomes the pattern for how we conduct ourselves every day. Jesus says if we want to follow Him, we need to take up our cross and follow after Him. I want you to look with me in chapter 17 of Matthew and how beautifully the business of taking up your cross, how beautifully that's exhibited with how Jesus conducts Himself just in the stories that are told in the next chapter. And there are three of those primarily. Look with me, if you would, at how chapter 17 opens. Please turn there if you're not there in your New Testament. Go to Matthew chapter 17 and look at the story that's told there where Jesus goes up on a mountain with three of His disciples, with Peter and with James and with John, and Jesus is transfigured in front of them, where they see they see beneath His human nature, and His divinity is manifested because He appears in glory. His whole countenance is changed so that He's gleaming and that He's bright. And so His divinity shines through. And not only is the divinity expressed in His countenance, but it's also expressed in the announcement that's made from heaven when God says in the presence of these men that this is my beloved Son. And he says, listen to him. It's manifested in the kind of company that he keeps when he's on the mountain, where Moses is there and Elijah is there and Jesus is conversing with them. And Peter likes the picture of Jesus that's here. And so he says, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let's build a tabernacle for you and a tabernacle for Elijah and a tabernacle for Moses. He wants to honor Jesus. This is the Messiah that he loves to see. But Jesus leaves the mountain and he comes back down. Because the path that he's on, to glory, is a path that must go to the cross. And his leaving that mountain is such a fitting picture of just all that Jesus has given up in order to be a sacrifice for us. He deserves to be on the mountain, doesn't he? I mean, he deserves to stay there. He deserves to be in the presence of the Father who pronounces these accolades on him, that this is my beloved Son. He deserves to be in the company of the heroes of faith and to be over those heroes. He deserves to be in the company of Moses and Elijah and to be celebrated by them. He deserves to have a tabernacle that's built to his glory. He deserves all of those kinds of things. But here is what taking up our cross looks like. It means leaving our castle. It means leaving our throne. It means giving up our rights. It means surrendering all of those for whatever the will of God is for me. And Jesus does that when he leaves the mountain, the place that he deserves to be, in order that he might go to the cross and minister on behalf of men. And the thing that confronts him when he comes down the mountain is another picture of just how Jesus has given himself up for us. He gives up his castle, he gives up his crown, he gives up his glory, he gives up his throne. And when he comes down into the valley, he finds that the people are in a tumult. There is a father who has a son that's demon-possessed. And so that story begins in verse 14 of chapter 17. And the father is desperate because he's brought his demon-possessed son to the disciples, and they're not able to do anything to help him. And so he's frustrated. He's frustrated with the disciples, and the disciples are frustrated because they've been healing people, they've been helping people, they've been casting out demons, they've been doing wondrous works themselves, and yet now they find themselves, it seems like maybe they've got a little overconfident. And now they find themselves at a loss because they can't help this guy at all. And so now they've got egg on their face. They look bad. And Jesus is frustrated. How long, he says? Look, if you would, at verse 17. Jesus answered and said, O unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring him here to me. And so he comes down from the mountain, he gives up all those things, and he comes down and he puts up with us. He puts up with us. And so it's another picture of what bearing the cross looks like. It doesn't just mean giving up your crown and giving up your castle and giving up glory, but it means giving up all those things in order to minister to folks who don't trust, who impute bad motives to you, who accuse you. In the case of the people here, that we brought him to your disciples and they can't do anything, and the disciples themselves show an unbelief here that is frustrating to Jesus. And yet, as frustrated as he is with man's unbelief, and as frustrated he is with the fact that they don't trust him, he is still patient with them. He still helps. He still ministers. He still cares. That's what the cross looks like. The last story that's told in Matthew 17 is when they come to Capernaum. Somebody asked Peter whether or not Jesus is going to pay the tax there. And there's a little conversation. This begins in verse 24. and following of Matthew 17, there's a conversation there between Jesus and Peter where Jesus is teaching Peter a lesson here. He says, do kings collect taxes from their sons? And Peter says, no, kings don't collect taxes from their sons. They collect taxes from strangers, not from their own family, from their own sons. And Peter is right about that. And the point that Jesus is making, that if people really knew who he was, they would not be asking him for taxes. There would not be any king that would tax God. There would not be any king who would demand payment from he that is the Son of God. But Jesus says they don't know that about me. And so Jesus pays a debt. And isn't that the picture of the cross? He pays a debt that he's not obliged to pay. That's what taking up your cross looks like. You pay debts that you're not obliged to pay in order to win favor, in order to win men, in order to redeem men. So the picture of what Jesus does there, all through this chapter, is a picture of what it means to take up your cross. Now look with me at Matthew chapter 18, and I want to make this practical for you and me. What it looks like when we take up our cross, what it means for me to take up my cross. And so start with me, if you would, in verse 1 of Matthew 18, where it says that at that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus called a child to himself and set him before them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you're converted and become like children, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever then humbles himself as this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." I want to say to you two things that Jesus illustrates in that text that are very practical demonstrations of what it means for you and me to take up our crosses. And that is this. Taking up my cross means that I give up my rights. I give up my rights. The disciples here are concerned that they don't lose anything in the kingdom, that they become everything that they have the potential to become. They're concerned about who's going to be great in the kingdom, what are going to be our positions. And their mindset is so different from what it means to follow Jesus. He says if we are going to follow Him, then we've got to become like children. Children, are they going to vote this fall? No, they're not, are they? Because children don't have the right to vote. Are you going to give your kids the keys and let them drive your family home today? You can't do that, can you? Because children don't have a right to drive. They don't have licenses to do that. Are you going to give them the checkbook? And are they going to make the financial decisions for your family? That you're not going to do that, are you? Because children, they don't have the right to be in that kind of position over our family and over its destiny. Children don't have the rights that those that are grown up have. And Jesus says that taking up my cross, this is what it looks like. Taking up my cross means that I give up my rights. That I give up my rights. Things that I I either really have or perceive that I have ownership of or a right of. I give those up. That's what taking up my cross means. Now look at how Jesus Himself has just illustrated that. He has a right to live in the castle, right? He has a right to be on the throne. He has a right to be worshipped. He has a right to be in the company of Moses and Elijah and over Moses and Elijah. He has a right to all of those things, but He gave up those rights for us. And so taking up my cross, He paid a debt that He didn't have to pay. He helped a man that He was not obliged to help and helped a son that He was not obliged to help. And rescued the disciples out of a predicament that He was not obliged to rescue them from. But He gave up His rights. And when I take up my cross, when I come to the table each week and am reminded of what Jesus did for me, it is a reminder that is my path. I give up my rights. I give up my rights. Is that the path that you're on? Or do you protect your rights? Does it get all over you when people trample your rights? Is it provocative to you when you have to give up? Taking up my cross in this same context doesn't just mean giving up my rights. It also means giving up control. Because children not only don't have rights that adults have, children also don't have control. We drove here today, and Omar was not neither Abraham either, but Omar was not at the wheel. He did not have control over where we went on the drive here. I had control over how we drove. But really, all things considered, really I didn't have any control either. I mean, I'm really not in charge of what's going on in the world. I am not in control. But I'd like to be. I like to be in charge of what's happening. I like to feel like, as our brother Dave said, I like to be independent. I like to feel like I've got everything under my control. But taking up my cross means that I give up control, that I become like a child in that respect, not only in that I forfeit my rights, but that I forfeit control. And ultimately, I have to yield that control to God, right? Jesus did that. He did that when He left the mountain. He does that in the cross. When you are crucified, does a crucified victim have any control over where he's taken? No. No, the executioners, they pick the place. They pick the time. You are pinned to the cross. You have no choice in the matter. You're paralyzed. You have nowhere to go. You have completely, if there's any picture of what it means to yield control, to give up control, it's the picture of someone who's being crucified because they're pinned to a tree. Where do they go? What do they do? Jesus made that very point to Peter at the end of the Gospel of John when He said, someday, He said, you get yourself dressed and you go where you go now. But He said, a day is coming when you're going to yield control and that others are going to take you where you would not choose to go yourself. Speaking of His death. And taking up my cross means that I do that I surrender control to God. Which means that I'm going to trust in the things that are happening in my life right now, the things that might happen in my life in the future, the things that are going on in the world, that I'm going to trust, just like a child does with his parents, I'm going to trust that they've got this. I'm going to trust that God is in charge. And so I'm not going to fight, and I'm not going to complain, and I'm not going to worry, I'm not going to fret. Because our Father, He's got this. And so taking up my cross means that I give up control. There's something more, though, to the business of taking up my cross besides just my relationship with God and forfeiting my rights and forfeiting control, giving up control. Jesus says in verse 7 of Matthew 18, "Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks, for it is inevitable that stumbling blocks come, but woe to that man through whom the stumbling blocks come. And if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It's better for you to enter life crippled or lame than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into eternal fire. If your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out and throw it from you. It's better for you to enter life with your 1 eye than having 2 eyes to be cast into the fiery hell. See that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that their angels in heaven continually behold the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which is lost." When I take up my cross, it not only means that I give up my rights and give up control. Taking up my cross also means that I weed out my wrongs. And this is the part of being crucified that surely we especially get. When I take up my cross, it means that I die to sin. Just the same way that Jesus died to sin. It means that I give up my wrongs. I weed out my wrongs. And Jesus is describing to us here in practical terms then what taking up my cross every day looks like. It means that I've got to be wise to those things about me that put me in a position of vulnerability to wrong. That I've got to be wise to the fact that this hand keeps getting me into sin. And with this foot, I keep stepping into the wrong places. And this eye keeps looking at things, wanting things, desiring things, lusting things, after things, pursuing things that I don't need to be looking at, that I don't need to be thinking about, because they are wrong. And so if taking up my cross means that I am weeding out those wrongs. There is nothing wrong in and of itself with having two hands, right? There's nothing wrong in and of itself with having 2 feet. There's nothing wrong in and of itself with having 2 eyes. But Jesus says, I am so committed to doing the right that I will forfeit my rights in order to avoid my wrongs. And so even though God made me with 2 hands, if need be, I'm going to be handicapped for Him. I'm going to give up a right because that right leads me into wrong. And even though God made me with 2 eyes and He made me with 2 feet, I want so badly to be with Him and to follow Him. And I don't follow Him with these feet, and I don't follow Him with these eyes. And so I am willing to handicap myself, if need be, in order that I don't do wrong. I'm weeding out the wrongs. Now that really takes an honesty on our part to consider, what is it that I'm keeping in my life that I need to nail to the cross? Is it my pride? Put a nail in it. Is it my anger? Crucify it. Is it some lust? Put it on the altar. Is it a relationship that takes me away from Him? That may not be wrong in and of itself, but leads me to wrong. It might be a friendship, it might be whatever. Put a nail in it, put it on the cross. Because taking up my cross means that I weed out my wrongs. He says, beginning in verse 12, and really through the end of the chapter, that taking up my cross has another dimension that relates to you and me. He says in verse 12, what do you think if any man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray? Does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go and search for the one that's straying? And then look at verse 15. And if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. And if he listens to you, you've won your brother. And then he says in verse 21, Peter asks the question. He says, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And Jesus said, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. And he goes on to tell a story about a man who has forgiven his debts, a huge debt. And yet he turned around and would not forgive the debt of someone who owed him, even though his own debt was forgiven. And if I could sum up those 3 conversations in which he talks about pursuing a sheep that's lost, and when he talks about going and confronting my brother who's in sin, or when he talks about forgiving someone who's making amends, the point that he makes in all of that is that taking up my cross means that I will give up my rights to redeem you from your wrongs. Get that? Taking up my cross means that I will give up my rights in order to redeem you from your wrongs. That I will be like Jesus in that respect. That I will hurt for the sake of helping you. That I will hurt for the sake of rescuing others. And so the shepherd might be very content to hang out in the sheepfold with the 99. But the fact that there's one sheep, the fact that there's one of us who's wandering on the hills, who might be lost in the wood, who might be trapped in a fence, who might have fallen into a pit, who might be drowning in a stream, all of that keeps the shepherd up at night. And so he can't bear the thought of leaving the sheep alone. And so he gives up the right that he has to comfort and to stay in the sheepfold, to go and find the one that's straying. He gives up the pride. He gives up the sense of outrage. He gives up the sense of being so angry at a brother who he sees in sin that he doesn't go to humiliate him. He doesn't go to shine a big spotlight on him so that everyone knows what he did. He doesn't go to show him his wrong and prove that he's right. He goes to a brother who's sinned in a way that is calculated to win him, to bring him back. And he does it privately because he wants to protect his reputation. But he does it nonetheless. It'd be easy to ignore it. It'd be easy to pretend like he didn't see. But he cares enough. He cares enough that he'll give up his rights in order to redeem his brother from his wrongs. And in the last story that Jesus tells, he'll do that even when the sin that his brother committed is not just a sin that he did in secret all by himself. It's not a sin that he committed against someone else, but when the sin is against me, that's the hardest time, isn't it, to take up my cross? It's when the wound is against me. And Jesus says that taking up my cross means that in that circumstance especially, and he devotes more content to that than he does to any of the other points here. Especially in that case, I give up my rights because I want to redeem, I want to rescue my brother from their wrongs. And so I forgive. And I forgive even if you've done it 7 times 7, 70 times 7. Because I care more about your destiny than I do about my hurt pride, than I do about the wound that was caused me, than I do about my feelings of vindication or of vengeance. I leave judgment to God, and I pursue a path that rescues you. Now that's what taking up our cross looks like. It means that we give up our rights. It means that we give up control. It means that we weed out our wrongs. It means that we give up our rights to redeem others from their wrongs. Isn't that what Jesus did for us? Isn't that what the cross accomplishes? He gave up his rights, right? He gave up control, yielded completely to God and to whatever purpose God had in mind for him. He had no wrongs himself to give up. But even when he was provoked to wrong, he didn't do wrong. And he gave up his rights in order to redeem us from our wrongs. And so the path that he set for us is the path that we trod. This is the pattern for how we live in our marriages. It's the pattern for how we live in the workplace. It's the pattern for how we conduct ourselves with each other. It's the pattern for how we live as citizens. We follow the way of the cross. We follow the way of the cross. And it is the path that's good for me. Because when I follow this way, guess what? I become like him. When I follow this path, I become like God. This is the way that God walks. It's the way that he works. And it's the way that he calls us to walk. And it's the way that he calls us to work. The way of the cross. Does that look like your life? Does it look like your walk? There's not a choice in that. This is the way we walk. If you're not following Jesus this morning, would you come to His cross? And would you see in His cross the picture of His love for you? Would you see in His cross the pain or the violence that your sin caused God? And would you see in His cross the path for the kind of forfeit of your rights, forfeit of your control, forfeit of your life that God is calling for in you? He gave up everything to win you. Would you not give up your will, and would you not give up everything to follow Him? Won't you confess Jesus as your Savior and as your Lord today? Won't you be baptized to have your sins washed away? Won't you come as we stand and as we sing?